Hello, and welcome to the 360 Speaker Series. I'm Linda Wilbur, filling in for Anna Smith, and I'm pleased to introduce MaiThu Perret. Today we welcome MaiThu Perret, who has created an exhibition in our lower level gallery that incorporates aspects of painting, sculpture, performance, and installation. These disparate elements are woven together with a rich narrative thread based on a fictional feminist art commune Perret created called the Crystal Frontier. The imaginary women of this commune live in autonomy in the New Mexican desert and make work that speaks to the human longing for utopia. Based in Geneva, MaiThu Perret received her BA in English Literature from Cambridge University, and from 2002 to 2003, she was enrolled in the Whitney Independent Study Program. Perret's work has been the subject of major solo exhibitions at such institutions as the Kunsthalle St. Gallen, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and Le Magasin Grenoble. As part of her current exhibition, Perret will stage a performance entitled Figures on June 2nd and a newly commissioned world premiere performance on June 4th at the Nasher Sculpture Center. Joining Perret in conversation is her longtime friend, artist John Armleder, who has been a principal figure in the international contemporary art world for over 40 years. Working in painting, sculpture, performance, and installation, Armleder and Perret have collaborated on multiple projects, notably under the banner of Armleder's Eckhart Gallery, and on the 2009 conceptual exhibition Voids, a retrospective at the Pompidou and Kunsthalle Bern. We're so pleased they could be with us today. Please join me in welcoming John Armleder and MaiThu Perret.
Hello, happy to be here. Is this thing? Yeah, that's
it is.
working.
It is working, right? You can. Yeah. Okay, good.
So how do we start at? Maybe we should start with asking you what kind of a project you're doing in the line of the other projects you've done before. What kind of a follow-up is it? It's all new work basically, which is shown here now.
Yeah. So you. The exhibition here.
The exhibition here.
So the exhibition here, yeah, is pretty much all new work, apart from the two large eyes, which are quite new because I made them maybe 6 months ago. And it's a series. Really, the starting point for the show was twofold. First, I was very happy, or I was excited about doing a show at the Nasher, and I came from many site visits and took in the great collection and old sculpture, and I thought I wanted to do something that involved freestanding sculptures and also basically statues, because I don't know, it seemed appropriate and it's right on time. I've made works in that vein before, and it's a thing that I kind of go in and out of making, and I wanted to go back to this type of art making. So yeah, here are some older examples. This coincided with my sort of becoming really fixated with events, and I think like a lot of other people in Syria and what's happening in the Middle East, and just generally the current politics. And I became very, very interested in developments in a place called the Free State of Rojava, which is a Kurdish enclave on the border between Turkey and Syria, where basically in the sort of what do you say, destruction of the Syrian state and of Syrian control through the war. I mean, on other things, the struggle with ISIS and so on, and with other kind of the civil war that is going on in Syria, a Kurdish government took power, and they set up a kind of revolutionary government system. And among other, according to very utopian, very progressive principles, and also specifically where they set up a number of female militias. So in a region that is generally, I think it's safe to say, quite, how would you say, traditional, rural, and even more so, it's really a, I'm struggling to find the word. It's very much a nomadic society with, and very patriarchal, basically. They set up these places, I mean, these militias that are ran by women, where women bear arms and defend themselves and their communities against the threat of, among other things, ISIS and various other, military groups. And I found that incredibly fascinating, and I watched many, there's loads of videos on the internet, and nowadays we live in a very particular time when you can suddenly become interested in a topic like that, and not only do you read, I mean, articles in the Times or magazines and things like that, but you can actually watch hours of videos about these people, which I did, and I became completely obsessed with them, and somehow I wanted to make a show that kind of in some ways commemorated them or was related to them. So part of the inspiration for the objects or the sculptures that you see in the exhibition are these women, these militias called the YPJs. And then, of course, this sort of dovetailed into older interests of mine with basically female communities and so on. And so, yeah, this is how I guess we got to the exhibition as it is now.
I have one question which always comes up when I look at your work, is that there's, in a way, two sides to it which are very clearly exposed. One is a political, social expression of your positions, probably, and one is a very formalistic one. And it's very clear in the show which is here, because in a way the painting, which is a stain painting on a carpet, a Rorschach image, kind of. In a way, it doesn't have the subtext that, of course, all the figures have around. And in between, there's the eyes, which you don't know exactly how they activate the whole process. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, it was very... always very important when I made, I mean, in all the shows that they do, but especially this one with this sort of content that was quite, that is very specific, very real, and very, could be very overwhelming in a way. That I would also introduce things that have absolutely nothing to do with the narrative. And the carpet, I mean, somebody mentioned to me that it was like a flag, and I thought it was actually quite an interesting comment, because I didn't really think of it that way, but it is a form of emblem or...
And you made many flags in your life. And
I made many flags, but I mean, this is a very particular flag because it's, in a way, it's like, it's sort of straddling two things that don't really go together, which is a kind of projection of the unconscious. So, I mean, this reference to the Rorschach patterns that are these test cards that psychologists use to diagnose, or I don't think they use them. I mean, I'm not very up to date on this. I don't think they're very used anymore. But it was at some point a very how do you say, prevalent diagnostic tool in psychiatry, and I've always been fascinated by them because it's this issue of projection and, what do you see when you look at an image? And everybody, of course, sees different things, and surely when they see my work, nobody sees what everybody else sees different things, and in fact, I see different things at different moments, and that's, I think, one of the reasons that you want to make art. It's because of this constant changing of relation to an object that is there and doesn't change. And so, yeah, the flag, I mean, the carpet painting, on some ways it functions like a flag, but then what does it represent? It represents the fact that you can't really have an emblem of what is going on. So do you see what I mean? That's sort of,
yeah.
And the eyes, again, I didn't really know why I wanted to have the eyes, but I knew that I had to break, the show's been a sort of, making the work has been a process of trying to break down the single-mindedness of the kind of reference material I was starting from. So I started making representations in a way of these people, or homages to these people, but then in a way, every single form or strategy that I employed was a strategy that sort of broke down the possibility of having a clear legibility, having a clear representation of these people. I mean, if you think of what a statue, a monument, for example, is like, you don't want to confuse, if you want to memorialize something, you'd rather not confuse the viewers by using too many materials, making things too collage, and having too many references to other things in there. And I think that's exactly what I did in that show. And the eyes, so to go back to the eyes was, it was a body part, which I thought was interesting in terms of these bodies of the figures. And now that I've been in the room with the show, I think for me, what's I like about the eyes is that they tweak the perception. And actually, I've just realized that it's a thing that I've done before, and I hadn't thought about it that way. But the eyes, because they're oversized, they make you question the ratio of the other things in the room. And so these figures are a bit like action figures. I mean, on some level, they are giant figurines or giant toys. But of course, they're life-size, and then you have these eyes, and it makes you maybe see the figures even more like small figures, and it makes also your perception of your relation to the objects in the room quite different than if everything was one-to-one. I think that's, so those are, like you say, they are, I think it's fair to say, fairly formalist ways of going about it, but it's also about perception and one's sense of being in the world and one's sense of the legibility of the objects that you're placed in front of. Does that make sense?
I don't know. And we don't need to make sense.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Thank God.
There's one fascinating thing about a show like that is that there's a strategy of perception, which you were talking about, but also because the figures are more or less, well, they are life-size. And at one point, there's always this thing about getting into the artwork physically. You know, Barnett Newman always wanted his paintings to be photographed with him or someone in front of them. So
to get the sense of scale. Right?
Maybe, or something else. We never knew exactly. Well, he talks in a different way about it. And obviously, in that show, it was very interesting while you were putting it up, because people thought there were more people in the space than actually there was, because there was a confusion between the actual sculptures. And it was like the people who were working here would say, what's all this crowd in that space now? And people are not supposed to be there because we're supposed to be putting up a show. So there's a sort of a misperception, or vice versa, a better perception. And I think those scale problems are very obvious in that show because, as you say, the eyes are big, but they're not as big as the Tony Tassett one. And
the one John is referring to on Main Street in Dallas, opposite the Jewel Hotel, is a humongous eye, which is much, much bigger. Yeah, but that's clearly, I don't know, a very different public scale object.
No, of course. Yeah. But I mean, what's interesting, and you know, you do like a fairly large San Francisco Jackson Pollock stain on the carpet, which is no more cleanable, and there's all those sort of venues in which we are invited to participate, and which is, I think, is interesting, is that the narrative, which is very often given with it, is about this sort of political position, which goes from feminism to political positions in a social kind of a situation. On the other hand, you can very well just forget all about it and look at all of that in a very formal point of view, which you can do with Jackson Pollock or San Francisco also.
Yeah, I mean, I never mean to close down the way that people interact with these things. And as a matter of fact, I think a lot of other people may come and see this show and not think about San Francisco and not think about Rojava.
I understand.
Or Pollock. So there's, and that's quite fair. I mean, that's totally fine.
But you do set up a stage, because it's really like a stage in which the people walk onto or are part of, which it happens always. I mean, when you go into an exhibition, there's a guy looking at the same painting as you are looking at. You have no idea what he's thinking about. He has a different kind of reference. But you don't really look at him. In that show...
I always look at the people in museums as objects in the museum. I think, because...
That's obvious. In that show, we understand.
In that show, yeah, no, but it's a thing. I think also that this, I mean, that's why I also started to say that I did the show also probably, it is in a very roundabout way influenced by the fact that it's in a sculpture museum. Because it's a sort of, I also have I think always like to sort of mimic the place, you know, the institutions and the environment in which I work. And in some ways there's a sort of, I mean, in some ways it's also a picture of an exhibit. It's not only an exhibition, it's an image of an exhibition. which is a concern that, do you know what I mean? This concern for things not being quite real and not being so, it's clearly not a Pollock or a Sam Francis, because it's not something that asks you to look at it very directly. It's, in a way, it's also a kind of I'm also very much a post-appropriation artist. Do you know what I mean? Like you are on some levels too.
Yeah. It's interesting that a lot of the references that one could bring historically to those kind of works are very foreign, as far as I know, from yours. It's like, if you think about Pollock, it starts with Surrealism in a way, which I don't think is your case, but maybe I'm wrong.
No, I don't think it's my case, but I mean, giant eyes, stains, projections, it's a very serious, I mean, there's that interest for sort of unconscious projection mechanisms or whatever is something I like about. I was thinking more actually about in terms of maybe Dada or things like that, things that are about a sort of rupture or a collage, that use strategies of formal strategies of disruption and cutting things up and having elements that don't fit together. To somehow, as it's something in Dada, it definitely has something to do with a particular political situation.
Well,
I mean, there's been many readings of
there's many Dadas. It's like
exactly,
sculptors and all these movements. There's people who have a position, some have another.
But if you look at
in the same pot.
Hannah Hoch collage,
Yeah,
for example, there's a sort of way that is expressing the horror of being living in Nazi Germany or in soon-to-be Nazi Germany, and in ways that are not direct at all. It's not she's not talking about Nazism specifically, but I think the formal, the disrupted quality of the collages is part of that, or is a way of dealing with that I find very, I don't know, efficient or it speaks, I relate to it.
So in a Dada way, how do you feel about bringing all those ladies with guns in a museum?
In a museum where you're not allowed to have guns in front? Yeah, well, that was a sort of a paradox of this show being shown. Again, this is all about changes of context and place, because I think this work in a European museum, people would have not, these guns would have just been a foreign object. Here, I'm not so sure. And I've been asked by a few people if, for example, this was a reference to the Vietnam War, which is something that I think it's the fatigues and the jackets, which are U.S. Army 60s, 70s era jackets. But so I understand that it would bring this association, and maybe people know that I'm partly Vietnamese. So, but I had no idea at the beginning of working with anything linked to the Vietnam War, and suddenly some people thought that maybe it had something to do with that, and I find that pretty fascinating, because it's just a question that's an American question, and so if you're in America, people are going to see the Vietnam War or things that speak to them in the work, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's nice that you talk about the Vietnam War. I think the problem with guns today is a problem of today. And
oh yeah, sure, no, but sure. I mean, also of course.
And I think there's irony, which is quite Dadaistic in this situation, is that the guns look like candies.
Yeah.
And is that on purpose?
That was always a very conscious decision, because when you watch these videos, there's like long, those Rojava videos, ISIS, these women who are fighting against ISIS, is like long things about guns when you watch them clean their guns, and when they say, oh, I didn't know that I could, there's a woman touch a gun, I didn't know how it worked, I was so afraid of it, I couldn't touch it, so all these taboos and everything. And then, in effect, there's this sort of gun fetishism that is very strong, and you always see the images are potent because you see these accessories. And then when I started making the show, it was obvious to me that I wasn't going to have real guns. That was quite obvious, and I didn't want I didn't want it to look like real in any way. I mean, I didn't want to have any possible confusion on that level. And I thought this candy color and this sort of regressive, because it is very regressive, quality of that it was what I was looking for. So. In the same way that when you're a little child and you see a toy gun and and it's brightly colored, you run for it and you want it. I wanted to sort of appeal to that drive, because guns are very people get very fetishistic about them. Fair to say.
I think it's a good place to talk about that, but the other thing is that when you, and I'm referring to, in fact, what I was trying to say before, when you look at the stage which you organize, in which you put the visitor into and he activates it, and at one point when a visitor is in and there's another visitor there, he doesn't really know who's the visitor and who's one of the artworks. In fact, there's this sort of confusion. So it's like a kind of a trap strategy. You're getting hold of the people and making them do things within the artwork, which basically artwork always does, but in a very passive way. I mean, I think someone who looks at an artwork becomes the artwork. It's an old Duchampian thing that we know that the artwork on itself is defined by the person who's looking at it, meaning that the guy who's looking at it next to you sees something totally different. And this is why maybe such talks are bizarre, because we're trying to ask you, as the artist, what your work is about, and the only thing that it is about is it's about a person looking at the work.
Looking at it, yeah, of course. Therefore, what do you want me to say?
How do you get involved? I mean, you get involved in a narrative, I mean, from one show to another, which is, I mean, basically, and that's a question that most artists have, certainly me, is once you've done one work, why do you do a second one?
Habit?
That's not a good answer.
That's not a good answer. No, it's, yeah, of course.
I mean, probably the traditional artist, which is a bit existentialist,
to make it, you mean to improve upon the
early? That's
definitely
the moral one, which is usually quite boring.
To get it right, that sort of thing.
No, basically, I think many artists, when they do a second work, is to cancel the one they did before.
Yeah, of course.
But what's interesting,
which is maybe a form of correction upon the work that was done before.
But then you do it to cancel the previous one, but you do the same, in fact.
Yeah.
And what kind of a disease is that? You have no answer?
No, you're...
Okay, so we need a doctor. There's another question I have, and it's a bit a selfish question, but in a way, the best, I would say, the normal position in front of doing a work is not doing it in a way. And something pushes us to do it nevertheless. And these things are coming from nowhere, which is not the thing I should be saying now, but it's an invitation from a curator or a critic or friend, another artist. It's a conduct which brings you into doing something. Are you conscious about that?
You mean do I think about what the nature of the interpolation to make the art is when I'm making it? You mean something like that? Or do you mean, are you asking me if I also have drives to make artworks when no invitation is around? Because there's a possibility that even if nobody invited me, I would.
You would go on doing it.
Yeah, maybe I wouldn't make this probably, because this is work that I mean, it specifically addresses. I don't know. It's made. This is definitely work that's made to be seen, and that is not. I mean, it's not definitely not a sort of solipsistic thing that I would do on my own, and I don't. It's very difficult to ask yourself what you would be if you were in a position that is absolutely not the position that you've always worked with, right? But I mean, of course, I ask myself. You always ask yourself why you're doing things, and how maybe you can mess with or play with all the expectations that are set up around invitations or being, the structure of, I don't know, the art, the life of an artist, the shows, even the system that means that you maybe you sell the work, or maybe you get a grant to do the work, or all of this apparatus that structures the way that you view the work. But that said, I think I also sometimes make, play around with little bunches of clay and stuff like that, and I would probably do that always, in some ways.
The question.
You don't like that one? You don't really.
The Play-Doh thing, it's perfect. No, you can't do better. We should never outgrow that moment. Being an old man and of a very specific period, when I started doing art, and I started fairly young, and being an after-war guy kind of person, the idea is that there was a freedom in doing art which would give you the chance to activate tools to change the world. I think this kind of a utopia is sort of difficult to grasp today because the situation is very different to your generation already, and even more so for the even younger people. Nevertheless, we're in a fairly vain way intervening in the world in a very active and heavy
preposterous way is what you're saying.
Well, there's museums, there's artwork all over on walls of private people and in institutions. It's part of something which is quite heavy in a world when you open the papers. This seems fairly vain in a way. How do you relate to that? You want me to go out?
No, I mean, I think maybe how I relate to it very simply is by making bizarre connections between a room on the lower floor of a museum in Dallas and some story that I read about in the newspaper about girls who clean up guns to go fight crazy Islamic extremists high on speed in a place. Do you know what I mean? I think that's exactly maybe that's one of the ways that you deal with, and maybe it's really completely vain to think that it has anything. I'm very aware that the relationship of this work to the things that in part inspires it is probably a very vain relationship that, I'm certainly aware of my lack of, let's say, right to claim any truth or direct knowledge about this situation or what these people are going through. It's all about my, reaction to it, and not at all. There's definitely no ethnographic truth if there ever was such a thing. But so maybe that's one of the ways that you deal with it. The other way is to, move to a monastery somewhere, which isn't. Do you know what I mean? Or maybe just to. Sometimes the impulse or the response is maybe just to be even more playful and even more somehow, playful or light. Or do you see what I mean? And, which I think is what you do very often. Yeah. Turn it back on you. I think your work in the face of all the stuff that can get quite heavy in life is your strategy has always been to achieve a certain kind of lightness and humor and detachment. Turn it back on you, man.
Yeah. What have I to say about that?
See? You.
Nevertheless, I think there's something which is strange. When you reach my age, it's even more strange because you think you've spent all your life doing those things. You don't know if you're just doing it for yourself, and it's a very selfish kind of position, which I think it is. And we have this idea that it's a generous move to exchange or to give away our selfishness to other people, and we have this idea that doing that we turn generous. Nevertheless, there's a problem there, is that I do believe we are, as artists, in a very privileged position, the most privileged position I think we can be in society, when we're in a better position than anyone else. Maybe priests have a lot of freedom, maybe, I don't know who else has the kind of ease that we have to say, I do that because I want to do it, and it's like that, and take it or leave it kind of situation. But that gives us a kind of a responsibility, and I don't know exactly how...
Responsible we are, you mean? Do you feel
well, yeah, because we have this freedom, we have this platform that most people in society don't have. They have to take care of so many other things, they don't have time to think about it like that. And I think because of that, we have a responsibility versus society, which obligates us in a way. And of course, that's a reverse discourse, because most artists don't feel obligated at all in any way. And I think it's wrong, but I don't know what to do about it. So would you?
Wow, that's, I think I understand what you mean about responsibility and privilege, but I don't think that, I don't think that saddling yourself with that question all the time is the best way to be responsible. It's kind of a cop-out of answering your question, but I think in some ways, do you know what I mean? It's like I think there is a moment when you have to suspend this. I think actually you just naturally do suspend those types of interrogations in order to have some form of freedom to maybe make something that is actually interesting or relevant, or hopefully could be interesting or relevant. That said, I think, sure, you're responsible for, I don't know, you're just also responsible for very basic things like, treating people properly and I don't know, all very basic relations of exchange and all of these things. And I think that's actually not a thing that's specific to being an artist. I think it's a thing that's specific to being a human being as soon as you're in any position to control your life. And do you know what I mean? So I don't know that, it's kind of weird for me to say that in relation to this, but I think the places where we make a difference in the world and where we are being political is not necessarily in the artwork at all. Don't you think? You don't know. You're raising all these pretty kind of serious questions, so I'm trying to answer. Think of how I answer them.
If the question,
because you're like throwing them at me, and
if the question is serious, the answer shouldn't be.
Ah, see.
Well, this thing about the artist, he would be maybe a helpful person that rather than helping an old lady to cross the street will show her where the other side of the street is. And
I don't understand.
Maybe me neither, but there's this idea that the artist gives a representation of the world or something like that, mm-hmm. That is informative enough to show you how to cross the street. Possibly.
Yeah.
What it doesn't say is why you should cross the street.
So what you're suggesting is that the old lady sits on the streets and meditates or something like that, or just sits on the street and has an ice cream, or should there be an ice cream stand?
If she's really good at it, she will stay on the same side of the street and have cross without even going there.
So if she's really good at it, she could practice telepathy, is what you're saying?
Something like that, but I think art has a lot of...
That's asking a lot of an old lady.
We are all old ladies in that sense. That's what I'm trying to say.
No, I understand that.
And we are all crossing the street also. But the art is putting this platform available in a very special way, because if you are doing most things in society, you're really only crossing the street from one step to another. The artists, in a traditional way, and we come from like French culture, you think of enlightenment in a way. So there's this sort of moment where you give an image which would be about this, about that. Like in your case, there's this political, feminist, political position, and also a perfectly formal position. And it should...
But I'm not sure it's about either. I'm not even sure it's about, about anything.
It's with something, no?
Yeah, it's with something. Mm-hmm. Something arrives, you take it, you make something with it, and then it's there, and then other people arrive and take it and make something with it. And for the purposes of, producing catalogs and exhibition brochures and discourse, we try to make sense of it by saying it is about, and sometimes we say it is about in ways that are more coherent or more intelligent or more better related maybe to what we think at this particular moment is going on with the work, but actually it's, in the end, it's not about it, without, it's like, it's the red wheelbarrow or something, at some point it's just there, it's a thing. That's, Well, maybe it's a super modernist way of thinking about things, but I definitely don't think the work is really about anything.
Mm-hmm. I believe in that also. On another hand, don't you think where there's overproduction, aren't we dumping tons of things on the planet that we really don't need to do?
Art, but a lot of other things.
No, that's not right, because you wouldn't survive without water, and you wouldn't be able to drink the water without a container.
Yeah,
what
but
you do with the container is a problem.
Does the container have to be plastic? Does it have to be from Nestle? Does it have to be, purified water? Whatever that means,
So that basically says,
why don't
must the painting be framed?
Yeah, what do you make? I mean, would you make your frame in radioactive materials that are, dangerous to the people who are looking at the painting? Maybe not.
God, I don't want to know what's in my paintings.
That's true. No, but I mean, of course. So there is. But that's a very I think it's also a very generational position that you're taking. It's a very 70s conceptual thing, to say there is Douglas Hubler is saying there is too much, there is too much art in the world, there is too much stuff in the world, and I will not make more. But you're making so much more.
In my case, I'm afraid. That's for sure. And again...
and you enjoy it when you do it.
Enjoy it.
You enjoy it quite a lot.
Enjoyment is a complicated position, because it's at the same time selfish, and at the same time can be shared in a way that would make the world, if not better, more enjoyable. So
you're a Catholic.
I'm a Catholic, yeah.
That's what it is, no?
Which is good, because you can have all your sins forgiven. That's true. And what are you?
I don't know.
Well, it's a quest which is a never-ending quest. Mm-hmm. So, what's next?
What's next? Maybe questions from...
Yeah. Talking about some of the images you have, I was wondering, some of them that are very strong, and maybe you can connect that to us with them.
You mean the particular images that are here, for example? Or?
Why you select some of them, and what they can give to us.
So I select, this slideshow is a sort of it's actually a slideshow that I've made for very different occasions. It's a slideshow that I've used in kind of conference situations or art school situations when I was asked to present my work, and I didn't have the privilege of doing it with someone like John, and I was more going through the evolution of the work or the different things I had done at different points. And so it's kind of a chronological array of artworks that have been made since 2000 to now, and some of it is also incorporates reference materials that were used in order to make the work, or things that were important when I made the work. So for example, here there is all this stuff about Crazy Cat and George Harriman, who's this American comic book artist who started working in the teens, and I think worked until the 40s. And I made a piece that was a performance piece with a choreographer who was very much based on Crazy Cat as a dance. And so this is what it is, for example, what it was. This is an image from the piece called Figure, the performance piece called Figures, which you may see if you come to see it in June at the Nasher. And it's also quite, it's sort of the beginning, it also introduced for me the use of these silicone faces, the sort of very realistic face masks that I'm using also in the exhibition here at the Nasher. And it's a play with a giant puppet. It's a performance with a giant puppet. So these, for example, yeah. And it's very much about a live dancer and a puppet and the relationship between these two objects.
Someone has a question.
The promotional material piqued my interest, and I wonder if you could comment about the exhibit that's here. Mm-hmm. Is that part of your work, as it's depicted here, about a fictional Feminine Art Commune and Utopian Society. Is this part of that same thrust, and could you explain it to us?
Yeah, so actually, I didn't read the blurb, so forgive me for not actually knowing what you're talking about, but I think I surmise what you're talking about, and it's the work that's there is not a direct, it's not the same people than the people that I have been writing about in this project called the Crystal Frontier with this autonomous commune in the desert in New Mexico. It's very germane to it, and it's a sort of evolution from it. But it's not, it doesn't fit directly under that rubric, if you will. But it's the continuation of this quite long work with the story, and to an extent, my trying to extricate myself from the story that I had created, I think.
You were talking about Jackson Pollock and Sam Francis, and that everybody, looks at it differently. These may have nothing to do with anything in there, but I couldn't help but think of John Baldessari when I was looking at your circles.
Oh, the faces.
The faces, and I just wondered, I mean, if you could comment on that, on the color.
Yeah, there is maybe a similar strategy than the one that Baldessari is using on his images. I mean, these circles, they arose out of a very basic problem, which is I was making these figures that were quite simple, they were quite crude, and I didn't want to paint the eyes and paint the mouth and be really realistic, and yet I didn't want to leave them blank. And so I tried all types of things and geometric signs, and then I came across this circle idea, and it seemed to work quite well because it's like a giant eye, so it is a bit of a cyclops type thing, and it also kind of canceled somehow the face, and in my mind also reminded me of more things like Dada, or where you have characters that are like that. So yeah, and I think in Baldessari it is a strategy that is something like that, which is a kind of this canceling out of the images that he's using by sticking this circle on them. So yeah. I started. Oh.
They would be putting up
you have to pick the questions. There's so many questions.
So
Can you say something about the oil on the window?
Oh, the Vaseline.
And then also, can you say something?
Oh, sorry, not Vaseline, petroleum jelly. It's yeah.
Say something more about you called the performance like a puppet, a dummy, a person related to them. Can you say something more about kind of the uncanny or the person relating with the puppet and how your performances work in that way?
Okay, so the window, the Vaseline thing, or the grease on the window was very much. It was one of the first things I knew when I saw this room, was that I had to do something with that glass. I felt it very, everybody feels it like a fishbowl, which it is, and I didn't want people to encounter the work straight on from the stairway. I wanted to break down the perspective and the look in there, and I didn't want to just put something in front of it. So I toyed with, I went through all things, like build a wall in front of it, cover it with, foil. Then I thought a curtain in silicone that looks like skin, so which I don't really know how it would be, but I had this kind of fantasy, and then at some point I was reminded of things I'd seen about using Vaseline to smear on, for example, lenses on cameras, and I just thought, okay, this could be a very simple trick that would look very beautiful and just blur the view. And it also makes the glass function, I think, in terms of the exhibition being some kind of machine for viewing, or it makes the people that pass through into this kind of kinetic painting. There's a permanent Gerhard Richter thing that happens when you're in there and the people are going down the stairways, and I find that quite cool. So that was the reason for doing that, and I thought it was a good material because it went to me well with all these faces, all these bodies, and all these guns, because, you grease guns and you put cream on your body, and there's something a bit kind of physical about it that I enjoyed, that it was Vaseline specifically, that it's a bit, which I like. And
people are going to think funny things.
No, but I think it's, I mean, in terms of making, it's a very, isn't it a very different thing than if I had ordered a gray foil to obscure the window, an industrial foil? It would have been very, like you have in advertising, it would have been a very different thing. And then the figures, I mean, figures, that performance, it started with Bunraku, which is a Japanese form of puppetry where on the side of a stage, set up like most forms of traditional Japanese theater, you have musicians and a narrator, a voice, and usually on the back something that depicts, say, a big pine tree or a sort of elements of a landscape or a house. And so in the center of so on the side you have people making music and a person who's singing and who's vocalizing. And the vocalizer is the voice of a giant puppets, plural, in real Bunraku. So there's these large-sized puppets, and they're being moved by very skilled manipulators who are really amazing at making them look real. But and the crazy thing about this is that you see the puppet, but you also see the people moving the puppet. And in our sort of Western-style puppetry, it's kind of, you have strings. I mean, the manipulator is hidden, so it's all about this sort of illusion of this illusionistic thing. And in Bunraku, it's more about the sort of marvelous kind of move in between, in and out of the illusion. So and focus into some parts of the puppets. And at moments, it's more real, the puppet, than the real people. So the movement will be so skillful, and that derealizing effect, that was the thing I got interested in, and that's how I created the performance. So, but I mean, it's quite a crude mannequin that we have. So I think it never is really quite lifelike. And then the dancer interacts with it. And there's all these faces that sort of come in and on and off the puppet, and in effect make her become different characters. And the singer is the voice of these different characters. That's it. Yeah.
Can I ask? Oh.
Yeah.
Because I'm kind of a straightforward person, I thought maybe I would ask you if you could talk directly about some individual pieces in the show, because I'm not sure that I really understand exactly what you're talking about and what your practice is about. So you mentioned the carpet. I know that there's a mannequin with a wig on it. Could you maybe talk?
There's a number of those.
Yes, there are. Could you please maybe explain to me, because I don't understand what?
You mean which one? The carpet or the?
Just quickly a little bit about a few of them, if you don't mind. Maybe other people do understand it, but I don't.
Okay. The carpet is a painting. And I make it by buying paint and dumping it on the carpet and folding it over and over again until I get a sort of image, a stain. And so that's what, I mean, materially, that's really all it is.
Is it like a Rorschach? Why fold it in half? Why try and do like what a child would do, in kindergarten, putting a piece of paper?
That's a big question about a lot of modern art, isn't it? Why do what a child would do? I mean, no, it is of course like a Rorschach, and it refers to that, and it's made. It's made like you make a Rorschach test, although it has. I often fold them both ways, so I don't really follow any rules about it. And they're, in a way, they're very kind of formalistic paintings. Now I find it quite special that it's on carpet, and now I don't make it on a canvas, which I could quite easily do, like doing with canvas, fold it. But I like that it's a kind of domestic material and something more industrial and something that reminds you much more of the floor. Which, of course, if you want to do a little bit, if you want to go back in art history, there is interesting things to say about artists who painted things on the floor and put them up on the wall. And I think it relates a lot to the body and also to mental projections. I mean, I don't know. That's what it is. And then the sculptures, they're figures. They're realist sculptures that work with definitely the idea of the mannequin. And I tried to in this show to play with many different types of materials. and to create a kind of collage aesthetic and to sort of have a panel of levels of realism, and from things that are more like special effects type materials, like the real faces, to things that are very crude and very handmade, like the paper mache with the circles. And I was interested to merge all of these different levels, together. That's what it is. And the shoes are bronze.
Well, I want to go back to the philosophical, existential things, but I love having this generation from the 60s and this other generation, but that you believed in change and revolution. But the thing that, two statements I have, and now I have my question. But one statement, the German artist Hans Haacke, that really, since the 60s and 70s, really dealt with the interrelationship of political and social, economic, and cultural systems. He said once, there's never been a painting that has stopped a war. And this other one I have is that Hal Foster, the great American critic, said, all art is political because you take positions. But I want to go back to the idea that you haven't brought up as much about feminism. And I just wonder, it's so much in the ether out there now about exhibitions and about writing, and so many people say it's feminist. And sometimes I think that sometimes it's not all about the intention of feminism. But anyway, I just want to address in your work as a feminist.
I think in a way it's more to me it's more interesting whether I am a feminist than if the work is feminist. Which doesn't mean that the work doesn't deal with issues that are germane, that are related to feminism. The work is in the world, and like you said, on some level it's apolitical, and it's just this rich this toy for people who have money and time to sit here and not it's a distraction. It's all these it's depressing and. No, but and then at the same time, definitely, I didn't mean, I never had the pretension of stopping wars, because if I could, I would have done it already. Wouldn't everybody have done it already? So, but I've been very influenced by ideas of feminism, and I also think that feminism can be a very it can be a very interesting tool for thinking about all manners of equalities. And so feminism is not just it's not only that. It's also it keys into other issues of I think somehow wanting the world to be less horrible. I don't know. Does that? It's very sentimental, but yeah.
I have a comment. I know we're getting towards the end. It's really a coup that the Nasher, in this particular time, has forwarded our feminism. It is one of the few places in America right now that has 3 women artists on show at the very same time.
Yeah, may I say something else? I have to say something to that, because I think we talked about this before. What I think is nice also about the fact that the Nasher is like this at the Nasher at the moment is that it's not especially being made a big deal out of, and I quite like it that it's not. It doesn't feel like somebody's made an effort to showcase the. It's just, it seems that these works have been shown here because the people are quite passionate about showing them, and it wasn't just. It's also just about the work, which I think is really quite fantastic. To me, it's quite flattering, and I'm happy about it. So, and I'm happy about that company.
So, and I hate to take and I don't want to be the last one to talk, but one of the statements made was that Jeremy and the Nasher itself did not do this show as just a feminist show. They did it because it was good art, it was here, and we could do it. So nothing but my applause to the two of you.
I don't think we could end on a better note than that. Did you want to ask it quickly?
Yes. I'd like to talk a little bit about process, but I would say that in terms of women's art, you don't have to go very far to see 3 women artists highlighted from the Nasher. The Meadows is doing it right now. I would take issue that there is a wholesale suppression of women's art in this country. But the Meadows has highlighted 3 women artists currently. But the question I have is about process, and it goes back to
process.
Process.
Okay.
And it goes back to the Kalashnikov in the candy colors, like big juicy fruits, and it means something to me. The source of those casts, was that something you made in your studio, or were they somehow available like toys?
So it's not cast from, I didn't go through I didn't try to get a real Kalashnikov. I went online in Switzerland where I live, and I went onto a website that sells pellet guns. So there's a whole subculture out there of people who have fun by shooting at each other with very realistic replicas of guns that shoot small plastic pellets, which and so that's what I got. I thought it was good enough for giving the feeling of it being real. I personally didn't really want to be involved with having a real gun. I mean, had I had the option of working with one, I don't even think I would have done it. I mean, I'm not so comfortable around these things.
Those colors, that's what you ordered. They came in those colors. These people that are, those aren't really pellet guns, are they? Aren't they? Are they the actual product?
No, of course. I mean, so what I did is I went online. I ordered a replica, a toy replica of a real gun, which is very real. And in fact, I had to sign I had to give my identity to the Swiss government so that they knew that I had this gun, because I think it can make, presumably you could use those and pretend that you have a gun to go maybe rob a bank or something. So it's quite controlled, these things. It's not super controlled, but they try to control it. And I took it and we made a 2-part silicone mold and we can't, actually it's more than 2 parts because there was a problem doing the butt part, turned out to be a bit complicated. But so we made a mold was made not by me, by people who make castings. And then we used a clear polyester resin with pigments and produced them in these colors. So that's how it was made. So it's a, yeah.
Someone has another question there.
This invites so many great conversations and questions. Our time has come to an end, though, so if you'd like to join us outside for further conversation.